All right, so the Washington Post just dropped an absolutely massive, explosive story on the revolving door between the United States military and Saudi Arabia. So I got a rundown here from Common Dreams' Jake Johnson on this massive, massive piece that was put together by the Washington Post, which I will link down in the description if you want to go watch or read through the entirety of it. But I mean, obviously, we've been talking about Saudi Arabia recently over the last couple of weeks and months. Obviously, we had the Joe Biden trip there where he basically got on his hands and knees and begged the brutal dictator of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, to release more oil into the global markets to try to tamp down gas prices here in the United States. Then again, we had the more recent news that he actually, with OPEC Plus, is deciding to slash oil production as a double middle finger to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party and the United States more generally. And now we just have this that has just dropped. So here from Jake Johnson, he says, defying Pentagon secrecy, reporting exposes retired U.S. generals on the Saudi payroll. Okay, so let's get into some of the details here. This shit is absolutely wild. He says, a sweeping investigation published by the Washington Post on Tuesday, after years of digging and legal battles with the U.S. government, shows that at least 15 retired American generals and admirals have worked as paid consultants for Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense since 2016. They got a quote here saying, Saudi Arabia paid advisors have included retired Marine General James L. Jones, a national security advisor to President Barack Obama, and retired Army General Keith Alexander, who led the National Security Agency under Obama and President George W. Bush, the Post reported, citing more than 4,000 pages of documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act filings. So, I mean, first of all, just my initial reaction to this is like, okay, this is obviously, something that is a pretty big deal just inherently, but it's also really not surprising. I mean, you have generals, admirals, you have people within the military who have then retired after, having a career of doing war crimes and human rights abuses in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, dozens and dozens of other countries that we have been engaging in overt or covert wars around the world over the last couple of decades. And basically, after committing human rights abuses and war crimes for the U.S. military, they of course go and get some of these cozy jobs advising the Saudi Arabian military to continue doing their genocide against the Yemeni people and working for a country that essentially is one of the largest exporters of terrorism in the region and around the world, honestly. So I mean, to some extent, it's not that surprising, but it's also pretty egregious that you're taking these jobs with a country that is like actively hostile to the United States in many, many different ways. So they continue here saying that the Post noted that it sued the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps and the State Department in federal court in pursuit of the documents, which the outlet finally obtained after a protracted legal fight. So obviously the U.S. government, the U.S. military was trying to keep this under wraps. And, I wouldn't be surprised if in a combination with a multitude of other factors that sort of this is part of feeding into the reasons why it has been so difficult to cut ties with the Saudis. I mean, if you have so many, former high up, very high ranking U.S. military officials who are now working and getting paid by the Saudi government, well, obviously that's going to play a role in influencing U.S. foreign policy towards this country, right? So, I mean, obviously that's not the main factor, probably that's not the only factor, but I mean, definitely that plays a little bit of a role in terms of our calculations with the future relationship with the Saudis. But they continue here with another quote saying, Congress permits retired troops as well as reservists to work for foreign governments if they first obtain approval from their branch of the armed forces and the State Department, the newspaper pointed out, but the U.S. government has fought to keep the hirings secret. For years, it withheld virtually all information about the practice, including which countries employ the most retired U.S. service members and how much money is at stake. So this is something that the American people, of course we should fucking know, where our retired generals are going to work, right? If they're working for foreign governments, let alone foreign governments. I mean, it's not like they're going and working for Canada or France or the UK or one of our more like, long-standing and deeply entrenched allies or something, but they're going to work for the Saudis. I mean, some of the worst human rights abusers on the entire face of the planet. I mean, it's like completely fucking disgusting here. And they were also obviously trying to hide it as well for, obvious reasons. But they say in total, the Post found that more than 500 retired U.S. military personnel, including scores of generals and admirals, have taken lucrative jobs since 2015, working for foreign governments such as Saudi Arabia, Libya, Turkey, and Kuwait, mostly with the official approval of U.S. military branches. They say records show that they rarely reject a job request. Yeah, I mean, no shit. Of course, these countries are going to want that added benefit of having some of that influence within the United States foreign policy by hiring some of our most high-ranking former admirals and generals. I mean, of course they're going to do that, but again, of course, that is something that we deserve to be aware of. We deserve to know, what type of influences this could potentially have on our own foreign policy, right? And the calculations that our elected officials are making on our behalf. But they say the Post did highlight some cases of ex-military officials taking foreign jobs or gifts without notifying the U.S. government at all, citing the prominent example of retired Army Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, a Trump loyalist and a fascist who raked in nearly $450,000 in payments from Turkey and Russia in 2015 without receiving clearance from U.S. officials. So, I mean, there's so much that you could say about Mike Flynn. I mean, one part of this, which I guess you could say is like borderline conspiratorial, although I don't think it's that conspiratorial to suggest this, but I mean, this is a guy who we know for a fact was making multiple trips to Mar-a-Lago to visit Donald Trump in the same location in the same time period where Donald Trump was hiding a lot of those classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And, this is a guy who obviously has corrupt ties with plenty of different foreign governments around the world, Turkey, Russia. I mean, I'm sure he has ties to Saudi Arabia as well. And, part of those documents that were there were like nuclear secrets and like top secret information that he could have been going, if he had access to it, and shipping around to all of these foreign governments that he is tied up with. I mean, the fact that like this is such an exposure of U.S. national security interests and military secrets and shit, it's just absolutely wild that this guy is able to go around and do this. And keep in mind, Mike Flynn, although he is now just sort of like a deranged QAnon conspiracy theorist, right? This is a guy who was like one of the top intelligence officials in our operations and our war in Afghanistan. I mean, this is not a low-ranking guy. This is somebody who worked as a top official for the Trump administration as well. I mean, these are the types of things that these people are going around and doing behind the scenes. But they continue down here, finishing off saying that the Post published its explosive story as a growing number of Democratic lawmakers are pushing for a total re-examination of long-standing diplomatic and military relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in the wake of OPEC's decision to again slash oil production, driving up prices in the U.S. and across the world. They say Saudi Arabia receives around 70% of its weaponry from the U.S. on top of other military and logistical support. And we got a quote here from Rokana, which I'll read. He says, Saudi planes literally couldn't fly if it weren't for American technicians, yet they are fleecing the American public. There needs to be consequences. And he's 100% right. I mean, listen, there's so many different things that you could say about our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, the whole idea, even from the perspective of like U.S. imperialists or from the military industrial complex and a lot of these hawkish politicians, the whole idea of this relationship was supposed to be, okay, we overlook the beheading of journalists like Jamal Khashoggi. We overlook the genocide in Yemen. Not only overlook it, but continue to help facilitate it, continue to give them the weapons to go do these things. And we'll overlook all of these human rights abuses domestically on the population in Saudi Arabia, which I'll actually show you guys some of the more recent stuff that we had. So we had this story that came out about the Saudi government choosing to execute 3 tribesmen who refused to leave their homes to make way for their bullshit, futuristic megacity that is never even going to be completed in the first place. And these are the types of things that they do. I mean, again, we had this clip that came out just a couple of days ago as well, just to give you a perspective in terms of where this relationship is at right now. Here from Ken Klippenstein, we had a Saudi prince named Saud al-Shalan, who is a close relative of Mohammed bin Salman, and he said this following Democrats' criticism of their oil price hike. Quote, anybody that challenges the existence of this country and this kingdom, all of us, we are projects of jihad and martyrdom. Okay, and this is not really the first time that they've floated these types of attacks against like Western countries, right? There was another example where they basically threatened Canada with a 9/11 in sort of like a tangential way with this ad that they put out with a plane, a graphic of a plane that was headed straight for Toronto in the city skyline, and it had a message that was something along the lines of like, people who stick their noses in, affairs that don't relate to them will have blowback consequences, basically. So I mean, listen, we have a rogue government here in Saudi Arabia that is not even benefiting us on the oil, right? Because again, that was the whole idea, is that you overlook all of the human rights abuses, the genocide, the beheading of journalists, all of that in exchange for the cheap oil. And now they're not even giving us the cheap oil. So it's like there is no perspective from any point of view that you want to look at at this, whether it's from a leftist critique and just saying, listen, because of the nature of who these guys are, because of how their government operates and the incredible human rights abuses and war crimes they commit on a regular basis, just in and of itself, we shouldn't have a relationship with them, let alone be supplying them with logistical and military support to continue their offensive operations, for example, in Yemen. And then there's also the perspective of like even a conservative or even a liberal war hawk or somebody who, believes in this relationship with the Saudis. Well, you're not even getting the cheap oil anymore. So what the fuck is the point? I mean, there is legitimately no argument at all for us to even have a relationship like we do with this country right now. And on top of that, you also see all of these like backroom dealings, these corrupt influences that the Saudis have on our political system. And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to fundamentally change our relationship with the Saudis. There was a story that came out a couple weeks ago that I didn't actually get to cover on this channel, where the Saudi government, through their various like financial means, were basically buying out the Republican Party to the tune of like almost $100 million in donations that are going to be funneled into their campaigns. And they're basically just buying the Republican Party. I mean, not to, say that they don't have sway over the Democratic Party as well. They definitely do have, bipartisan sway over both parties in this country. But I mean, they have immense control over our foreign policy. They have immense control over our political system. It's just brazenly corrupt. And then you also have the added aspect where, a lot of these people who sit on like the financial or the Armed Services Committee, for example, in the Senate, they have investments in the same defense contractors, the same weapons manufacturers that are selling weapons to the tune of billions of dollars to the Saudis. So it's like you have so many different corrupting influences here. You have, the Trump deals with the emoluments clause violations with his hotels that the Saudis were staying in and funneling him thousands and thousands of dollars. You have the $2 billion that were given to Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, for his bullshit investment firm that even the Saudi government calculated wasn't going to be a good investment, but they just did it because they're basically buying them off. You also had Trump connections with the Saudis on the Live Golf Tour, where he's going to be making millions and millions and millions of dollars off of that deal as well. And then now you add on this recent report from the Washington Post, which again, I'll link down below if you want to go read through the entirety of it. Now you just have this brazen revolving door of top-ranking military officials to go after committing widespread war crimes and human rights abuses for the U.S. government and the U.S. military, now going and being advisors and military strategists for this incredibly brutal regime. So, I mean, none of this makes sense from any perspective that you want to look at it. It's just brazen corruption and backroom dealing with one of the most brutal and authoritarian and dictatorial theocratic regimes on the entire face of the planet.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying